Joining me now is author of international bestsellers, including The Madness of Crowds, The Strange Death of Europe and the War on the West, Douglas Murray. Douglas, let's start with today's momentous news. The Supreme Court has handed down its ruling declaring affirmative action is, well, unconstitutional. Universities can no longer use race to select applicants, and the Democrats and their media allies are very angry indeed, Douglas.
Yes, that's right, Rita. It's an extraordinary judgment. It's not the first bombshell judgment in the last year from the Supreme Court, but it's an extraordinary judgment, and it's been about 10 years in the coming. In 2014, a group of Asian American students began legal proceedings against Harvard because they had applied to Harvard, had all of the correct qualifications, and had been turned down. And they noticed that, among other things, there was a continuous number of Asian students in Harvard, despite the fact that the Asian American population of America was growing. In other words, they correctly surmised that there was a racial quota system going on. Now, of course, Harvard denied this, and it had to be dragged kicking and screaming through the courts. And Harvard was shown to be exactly doing what its critics had said. It was prioritizing certain ethnic groups, particularly Black Americans, and downplaying the achievements of certain other overrepresented groups, as they saw it, especially Asian Americans. And today's announcement, the announcement this week of the Supreme Court, says this is unconstitutional. In the name of racism, this is actually, in the name of anti-racism, rather, this is actually racist. And institutions cannot do this. And so you see, the interesting thing is, really, just finally on that, is that although people are thinking, to some extent, this is a university sort of thing, and everything to do with the university sounds a bit rarefied. Who cares who gets into Harvard or not? But actually, it's not just about Harvard and not just about the education system in America. It's about corporate America, because all of corporate America has been doing the same thing. They're busy not just selecting people on merit. It's all race-based. The Supreme Court has said that's not just un-American, it's against the Constitution.
Absolutely. And we saw Joe Biden doing just that when he was selecting a Supreme Court justice. The first thing he said is it will be a black woman, rather than look at her credentials, look at who's the best person for the job. And not surprisingly, President Biden has slammed this decision and said the Supreme Court was not a normal court. He said, I believe our colleges are stronger when they are racially diverse. But Douglas, this is just racism, as you said, institutional racism. Have a look at this data that shows an Asian American in the fourth lowest decile has virtually no chance of being admitted into Harvard, 0.9%, but an African American in that same decile has a higher chance of admission than an Asian American in the very top decile. I mean, that is just virulently anti-Asian and anti-Indian, so many other nationalities who
it's anti-everyone. Yeah, it's anti-everyone, Rita, because, I mean, first of all, by the way, what Biden said about the court is absolutely disgraceful. If Donald Trump had been asked whether he thought the Supreme Court was a rogue court, which was what Biden was asked, and had said what Biden said, we would hear shrieking at the moment that the president was against the Supreme Court, it was the end of democracy, everything was about to fall down. But Biden is allowed to repeatedly slam the Supreme Court, and that seems to be okay. And your point, Rita, is incredibly important about this, because one of the other things which is being smuggled in is that people are pretending that American universities will not be racially diverse if they don't do race quotas. Well, I have enough confidence that there are enough smart black Americans to get into Harvard. I've got plenty of confidence there are plenty of smart people of all racial backgrounds. But these people who say otherwise or pretend that somehow there's not going to be any diversity if you don't have quotas are revealing what seems to be a racism of their own.
Absolutely. It's the bigotry of low expectations, and the left is often guilty of it. And we have seen some commentary today from some Democrats, which is just so racist, where they just think black Americans couldn't possibly get into Harvard if it wasn't for affirmative action. Now, you've talked and written about the leader of the free world this week. You said Joe Biden is not all right, and you note that the Democrats seem to be outdoing each other in incapacity. And we've got another example, I think this was yesterday, of Joe Biden showing he's not all right. He mixed up Iraq and Russia.
It's hard to tell, but he's clearly losing the war in Iraq. He's losing the war at home. And he has become a bit of a pariah around the world. And it's not just NATO. It's not just the European Union. It's Japan. It's 40 nations.
There he was talking about Vladimir Putin losing the war in Iraq. But the examples of cognitive decline, Douglas, are abundant. We play them every single week. We're never short of content.
No, I know. It's getting quite sad, actually, because the Democrats' desire to hang on to office is something we've discussed before, and it is extraordinary. I mean, they wheeled in a very distinguished senator, Dianne Feinstein, who's now 90. They literally wheelchaired her in to the Senate recently, and she seems to think she's been in the Senate when she hasn't been in recent weeks. It's really rather sad. Then they put up John Fetterman as a senator last year, despite the fact that he'd suffered a catastrophic stroke, poor man, and his wife had to give his acceptance speech for him. He was speaking the other day and spoke beside Joe Biden and seemed to have described Joe Biden as a collapsed bridge, which is quite interesting. And even Biden looked a bit confused by that. But then this is Biden who, remember last year, you mentioned the Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson. Remember when he announced her nomination, her appointment last year, and he said, America is a country you can sum up in a single word. And I think I've got it right, that the word he then said is certainly new to the English language, indeed to any language, and it went something like, I am fatum bum bum Himalaya. Even Kamala Harris looked kind of bemused about this. It is very sad. The part, it's always been an international joke that right-wing Americans leaders are no good at speaking, and it's pretty unfair actually. People like Reagan was a terrific communicator, but it's actually the Democrats that are putting up people to speak to the American people who can't speak to them.
No, and with Biden, they're trying to use the excuse, well, he's got a stutter, but you know what? I've seen his speeches from 30 years ago, 20 years ago. There was no stutter. This is cognitive decline. Yeah. It is not a stuttering issue. Now, let's move on to Gen Z and their embrace of radical gender theory. We've got data now showing 51% of this group say there are more than two genders. And I think this has all sorts of implications, Douglas. You've written this week about so-called gender-affirming care for children. And when you become to, accept that there's 150 plus genders, that we all have to declare our pronouns, then you become comfortable with these irreversible treatments being inflicted on confused young children.
Yes, I mean, there's a term there, isn't it, Rita? Gender-affirming care. Sounds so nice. You wouldn't notice if you didn't bother to look into it that it involves, for instance, flaying the leg or the arm of a young woman, giving her irreversible scarring, and then trying to create a phallus. I mean, that's gender-affirming care. Apparently, it sounds so lovely until you look at the facts. I'm confused. A
useless phallus.
Yes, absolutely. I'm very worried that people have just been indoctrinated into this stupidity. There are only two sexes. There are lots of different expressions of sexuality people can have, but they don't change biological reality. And my worry about this has always been the same, which is effectively I don't like lies. I don't like untruths being pushed into the public square, because I know that what comes next will be another lie and a bigger lie, and you'll be asked to believe something even more ridiculous next week than you were this. That's why this is important. It's not just about a craze or a fad. It's about people who have been made highly susceptible to totally provably wrong things.
Absolutely, and that's precisely what Dr. Jordan Peterson said too about this data. He said if you swallow the biggest possible lie, then you're prepared to swallow all the other lies that follow. Absolutely. And that's one of the enormous worries here. And finally, more madness from your home city of New York, where there is a fatwa against coal and wood-fired pizza being declared. Apparently this is going to save the environment. It's upset a few people. Here's one angry New Yorker who's throwing pizza slices at City Hall.
Give us pizza or give us death. New York City is nothing without pizza.
Douglas, what is going on in your adopted home city?
Well, this is the latest in a development of ones. There was an attempt, the Democrats announced last year that people's gas stoves would be removed from them. And now people's coal wood-fired pizzas are meant to be wrestled from our cold, dead hands. I think it's a mad row to pick with New Yorkers who are not going to give up their pizza easily. But it's another example of the crazy way in which a certain type of Democrat left-winger decides that you know, all the difference in the climate change issue will be decided by whether or not New Yorkers have wood-fired pizzas for dinner. And I'm fairly sure that the main polluter in the world remains countries like China and India, and they really don't care much about a few New Yorker Manhattanite pizzas. I don't think it's going to be the tipping point in the whole global warming thing.
I just can't believe you can't get a good slice in New York shortly. I mean, you need a wood-fired pizza oven to get the perfect slice. And just another reason to avoid New York these days. Douglas Murray, thank you for joining me.